The HOA thought they had struck gold by building 96 dream homes, but the real owner of the land was waiting, and they walked right into her trap. Imagine waking up one morning, looking out your window, and realizing the land your family has protected for generations is suddenly covered in brand new houses. That's exactly what happened to 62-year-old Marjorie Whitfield, a retired school administrator in suburban Georgia. For her, those 40 acres weren't just dirt and grass. They were history. Her parents had worked hard to pay for it, piece by piece, and as a child she'd run barefoot chasing fireflies and listening to her father promise her that land was the one thing they couldn't make more of. Unlike many people who inherit property, Marjorie never neglected hers. She paid the taxes every single year on time, kept her papers locked in a fireproof safe, and even had her attorney friend Samuel Drake review the title every few years. Samuel once told her she had built a fortress. He was right. So you can imagine her shock when one summer she drove past a back road near her property and saw a bulldozer cutting into the earth. At first she thought it was routine county work, but within a week survey stakes were everywhere and construction crews were pouring concrete. She pulled over, waved down a worker, and asked what was going on. He answered, "New subdivision, ma'am, Lakewood Meadows, 90-something homes. Gonna be beautiful." Her stomach dropped. 90 homes on her land. Surely it was a mistake, she thought. Surely professionals had checked the records. But as the weeks passed, houses started rising, rooftops appeared, siding went up and moving. Trucks started rolling in. She told her friends at church, and most didn't even believe her. How could builders just build without permission? But Marjorie had the proof. She pulled out deeds, tax receipts, maps going back to the 1950s. She whispered, "They didn't ask, and they didn't check." What she didn't yet know was that decades earlier, a clerical error had left her property listed vaguely in county files. The HOA and their partner developer assumed it was unused, swallowed it up into their subdivision plan, and extended their reach without realizing nearly 40 acres were still under private ownership. To them it looked like empty space. To her it was sacred ground. As the first families moved in, the HOA president, Clifford Myers, bragged to the local paper about building a thriving modern neighborhood. Behind the photos and ribbon cuttings, however, Marjorie was at her dining table every evening, spreading out documents, circling dates, drafting letters with Samuel. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't chaining herself to trees. She was preparing. She knew once the court saw her records, there would be no question. Those homes weren't theirs. They were on her land. And she knew the only question was how steep the price of her victory would be. Her preparation hadn't started that summer. It had begun years earlier. Twice a year she drove into downtown Macon to check tax records in person. Clerks teased her for being old-fashioned, but she always smiled and said, "I don't like surprises." 3 years before bulldozers ever arrived, she had already sat down with her lawyer, updated her will, and even filed a quiet title action to reaffirm ownership in court. Samuel had called it belt and suspenders lawyering, but that one decision would prove to be the trap that later caught the HOA. Meanwhile, Clifford and the HOA board saw Marjorie as invisible. To them, she was just another retiree mowing too much grass. They didn't realize she was the only person in the county with the power to dismantle their empire. In meetings, Samuel warned her that once families moved in, the stakes would get emotional. People would see her as the villain even though she was the rightful owner. She simply stirred sugar into her tea and said, "Ignorance doesn't move a bulldozer." As construction picked up, she didn't protest. She documented. She filmed trucks rolling in. She photographed foundations being poured. She logged dates and details. She even kept a binder labeled Evidence Lakewood Meadows. When her cousin Thomas asked why she wasn't making a scene, she answered, "Because noise fades, paperwork doesn't." Every week her case grew stronger. The irony was brutal. While the HOA toasted their success, Marjorie had already laid the legal groundwork to undo everything they were building. Her taxes were paid to the penny, her title reaffirmed, her evidence airtight. The HOA, on the other hand, charged forward with blind ambition. Clifford loved the spotlight. He gave speeches about legacy neighborhoods, promised rising property values, schools improving, retail moving closer, a safer and stronger community. Homeowners cheered. Families rushed to buy. Moving trucks arrived. Kids raced their bikes down cul-de-sacs. To outsiders, it looked unstoppable. But cracks were already visible in the foundation. Contractors whispered about vague land records. An accountant flagged discrepancies. A county clerk mentioned the Whitfield name still showing up in databases. Clifford brushed it all aside, insisting momentum was everything. If they slowed down, they'd lose buyers. At one HOA event holding a plastic cup of wine, Clifford even joked, "Land's land. Half the time it's tied up in red tape. We just cut through it." Families laughed nervously, but his arrogance sealed the story. Because while he raised his glass, Marjorie was sitting a mile away with her binder of evidence watching his every move. To him, she was invisible. To her, he was writing the first page of his downfall. By winter, homes were decorated with holiday wreaths and televisions glowed through brand new windows. To those families, it was paradise. But Clifford's recklessness had dragged them all into a nightmare they didn't yet see. By then, Marjorie had stopped casually driving by. She now filmed every detail like a teacher giving a lesson. Lot 12 framing completed, Lot 14 roof installed. She wasn't narrating for nostalgia. She was building her case. And, one afternoon, standing in her kitchen, she shook her head and said quietly to her cousin, "I still can't believe they just plowed right over my land." Like I was invisible, Thomas shook his head and said, "They think money makes them bulletproof, but you've got the law on your side. Don't let them scare you." But intimidation came quickly. The first sign was a glossy flyer slipped into Marjorie's mailbox advertising the Lakewood Meadows expansion, homes starting at $299,000. She stared at the flyer, recognizing the outline of her own land printed on the map, and let out a short, bitter laugh. When she showed it to her attorney, Samuel Drayton, he rubbed his chin and frowned. "They're not hiding it," he said. "They're daring you to challenge it." "And that's exactly what I'm going to do," Marjorie replied. The next hint came at a grocery store parking lot where she ran into her neighbor, Glenda Barnes. "You seen what they're building?" Glenda asked. "Seen it," Marjorie snapped back. "And it's mine." Glenda blinked, confused. "What do you mean yours?" "That land they're building on is my inheritance," Marjorie told her. "They just didn't bother to check." The word spread quickly, first whispers, then questions in church pews. A woman asked her if it was true she was suing the subdivision. A deacon quietly suggested she should just take the money and walk away. But Marjorie wasn't after cash. She wanted justice. Her first official step was a cease and desist letter drafted by Samuel. The HOA received it on a Friday morning, and Clifford Myers, the president, read it and laughed. "This woman thinks she's going to scare us with paperwork," he told his board. "She doesn't have the resources to fight us." He tossed the letter aside. But Marjorie wasn't bluffing. Within weeks, Samuel filed suit attaching decades of deeds, tax receipts, boundary maps, even probate records from her parents. The complaint landed like a hammer. Clifford still brushed it off, insisting to Hanover Construction it would get tossed. These cases always do. What he didn't realize was that Marjorie had prepared for this very moment long before they ever broke ground. Meanwhile, families were unpacking moving trucks, kids were racing bikes, flower beds were being planted. They had no idea their dream home sat on disputed land. One homeowner, Victor Ramirez, remembered hearing two workers argue near his driveway. "This land isn't clean," one said. "There's still a Whitfield name on file. Doesn't matter." The other shrugged. "Houses are sold already." Victor brushed it off at the time, but later those words echoed. At Marjorie's home, the pressure grew heavier. She and Samuel strategized almost daily, poring over the HOA's responses. The attorneys weren't denying the land was hers. They were trying to argue she hadn't actively used it, that her claim was outdated. Samuel smirked when he read the filings. "They're desperate," he said. "This won't hold." Still, Marjorie understood how it would look. "They'll paint me as heartless," she told him one night, "like I want to kick families out of their houses." Samuel nodded. "You need to be ready for that. This isn't just law, it's optics." She was ready. She braced for whispers at the grocery store, cold looks at church, and the quiet pressure to back down. but she hadn't carried her parents' sacrifice all these years just to hand it away to arrogance. By early spring, Lakewood Meadows sparkled like a brochure. Cul-de-sacs finished, sidewalks poured, streetlights glowing. Families were thrilled. Victor and Angela Ramirez moved in with their kids. Angela walked through the model kitchen and said, "This is where we'll host Thanksgiving." Victor signed the papers with pride, thinking he'd secured stability. Nearby, Lauren and Tyler Briggs bought a 3-bedroom home and finally had a backyard. Tyler watched his dog chase sticks. Lauren painted a nursery for the baby on the way. On another street, Darnell and Monica Price, retired and hopeful, told relatives they'd finally found the place to grow old together. For them, it was peace at last. The HOA celebrated each sale with confidence. At every meeting, Clifford boasted, "We're 80% sold already. This community is a model for the region." Applause followed, glasses clinked. No one questioned him. But whispers trickled through the streets. Some neighbors heard rumors of a woman claiming ownership. "Scare tactics," one man said. "People always come out of the woodwork when money's involved." Yet unease grew when a few residents received legal notices taped to their doors. Angela Ramirez handed one to Victor with trembling hands. "Is this real?" she asked. He read it twice, trying to convince himself it couldn't be. They wouldn't sell us a house on land they didn't own, but the pit in his stomach deepened. On Sunday afternoons, Marjorie sometimes drove slowly through the subdivision, watching kids pedal bikes on streets named after trees that once grew there. Where pines and oaks had stood, there were vinyl siding and mailboxes. She felt no joy, only steel in her resolve. She didn't hate the families, she pitied them. They were caught in the HOA's arrogance, but they weren't her responsibility. At homeowners' gatherings, tension broke the surface. Clifford stood at the clubhouse smiling, telling worried residents not to fear. "Yes, there's a woman making claims, but our attorneys assure us there's no merit. You have nothing to worry about." A man called out, "What if she wins?" "She won't," Clifford shot back, "and even if she tried, the county won't let 90 families lose their homes. Trust me, we're solid." His words calmed some, but not all. A few residents went online and looked up Marjorie's name. They found her spotless tax history, probate filings, even old photos of her family on the very land their homes now sat on. This wasn't a crank. This was the rightful owner. Angela sat at her kitchen table whispering to Victor, "What if everything we've worked for disappears? What if we're squatting and don't even know it?" Victor clenched his jaw. "I'll fight before I let that happen, but if this is true, we bought into a lie." By summer, Lakewood Meadows looked alive, sprinklers spraying, mail trucks making their rounds, lawnmowers buzzing. On the surface, it was a neighborhood thriving, but under the cheer was a quiet dread. Homeowners wondered if their ground truly belonged to them. For Marjorie, each new sold sign confirmed her case. The more homes built, the more expensive the mistake, and she had every receipt, every map, every scrap of proof. And while Clifford reassured and families unpacked, the lawsuit gathered speed. Soon none of them would be able to pretend the land was theirs. The first homeowners to receive legal notices were shaken. They realized Marjorie wasn't bluffing. Her attorney had filed in Superior Court, attaching 4 decades of records, a timeline of stewardship no judge could ignore. Marjorie herself never stormed offices or raised banners. She moved quietly, deliberately, as though she had been rehearsing this confrontation her entire life. At her dining table, she and Samuel went through thick packets of responses from the HOA's lawyers. "They're leaning on technicalities," Samuel said, "trying to argue you abandoned the land." "Abandoned?" Marjorie raised her eyebrow. "I paid those taxes every year while they were throwing parties." Samuel smiled, tapping her stack of receipts. "This will shred their argument." Word of the lawsuit spread quickly. Some homeowners thought it was rumor until letters addressed to occupant landed in their mailboxes, warning their homes might be subject to legal action. Panic bubbled. Angela Ramirez called Marjorie after finding her number. "Mrs. Whitfield, I'm not against you, but what does this mean for us? Are we going to lose our home?" Marjorie paused, steady. "Angela, you should never have been put in this position. I don't want to hurt families, but I can't let the HOA steal from me." "This fight isn't with you, it's with them," Angela whispered. "I believe you, I just don't know how we'll survive if it falls apart." The more homeowners learned, the more pressure landed on Clifford. At one meeting, residents shouted, "You told us everything was fine." Clifford raised his hands, insisting it was one woman trying to extort them. Another resident shouted back, "She has the deeds." I looked them up myself. The room erupted, Clifford's confident veneer cracking. Behind closed doors, Hanover Construction grew restless, their legal counsel warning every home could be tied up in court. Investors hesitated, realtors went silent, the project was rotting from the inside. Marjorie, meanwhile, carried calm determination. For decades, she had been underestimated because she wasn't loud, but she understood real power didn't shout. It built quietly until it couldn't be ignored. Samuel urged her to stay measured. "You're winning this on paper, don't get dragged into theatrics." She smiled faintly. "I don't need theatrics, I just need the truth." Still, the pressure pressed in. Anonymous letters appeared in her mailbox. One read, "You're ruining families, drop the case." Another warned, "You'll regret this." She showed them to Samuel. He frowned but said, "Don't be rattled. This is their fear talking. Fear means we're closing in." At church, some people avoided her pew. Some whispered she was greedy, others said heartless. She prayed quietly, head high, thinking if they only knew the whole story. What steadied her was remembering her parents' sacrifices, her father's long hours at the mill, her mother's careful budgeting to keep taxes paid. To let that legacy be erased by arrogance was unthinkable. This lawsuit wasn't just about her, it was about respect, about standing up when others expected silence. And while the HOA doubled its efforts by hiring a bigger Atlanta law firm, Marjorie sat at her table with her binder, the weight of history on her side, and the storm still gathering. Clifford gave interviews to local news outlets painting Marjorie as unreasonable, saying they had offered her compensation but she wouldn't compromise, that the HOA was only trying to protect families from being displaced. Marjorie saw the clip on television and shook her head. "Compensation?" she muttered. "They never offered me a dime." The lies only steeled her resolve. She had spent her life teaching children that honesty mattered and that actions carried consequences, and now it was her turn to prove it in the real world. Her case wasn't about making friends, it was about making things right, and she knew. The longer it dragged on, the more the HOA would reveal its weakness. When the case finally reached the courtroom, the whole county was talking. Local papers splashed headlines about the land dispute across their front pages. Whispers filled coffee shops and barbershops, and school hallways buzzed with speculation. 96 homes sat in the balance, and everyone wanted to know if quiet, 62-year-old retired administrator Marjorie Whitfield could actually bring down an entire homeowners association. The courtroom was packed. Families from Lakewood Meadows crowded onto wooden benches, some clutching mortgage papers as if that would shield them from the outcome. Realtors, bankers, even county officials filled the aisles, all eyes fixed forward. At the center of it all sat Marjorie in a simple navy dress with her documents stacked neatly in a manila folder, beside her attorney Samuel. Her face was calm, though her chest thudded hard. Across the aisle, Clifford leaned back, whispering to his attorneys in expensive suits, his smirk suggesting he still thought he could spin things his way. Judge Patricia Long banged her gavel and the trial began. Samuel spoke first, his voice steady and clear, laying out the simple truth that his client had maintained continuous ownership for 40 years, paid every tax bill, safeguarded her title, and yet the defendants had built an entire subdivision without consent. "This is not speculation," he said. "This is theft." The words made homeowners squirm in their seats. Clifford's attorney countered with appeals to sympathy, saying that 96 families now lived there and Marjorie was seeking a windfall at the expense of hardworking people. Marjorie's jaw tightened, but Samuel whispered for her to let him talk, that the more they leaned on sympathy, the weaker their legal footing became. Witnesses came and went. County clerks confirmed her taxes were always paid. Surveyors testified the subdivision overlapped her parcel. Samuel spread maps and deeds like puzzle pieces that fit perfectly. When Marjorie herself took the stand, the room went still. She spoke not with anger but with quiet conviction. explaining that her parents had worked themselves to the bone to buy that land and told her to protect it, and that she hadn't built the houses or invited the families, but the HOA and builders had made that choice, and now they wanted her to be the villain for standing up for what was hers. Some homeowners looked at her differently for the first time, not as a faceless enemy, but as a woman wronged. Clifford, on the other hand, began to unravel. When pressed on the stand, he admitted they had relied on partners and hadn't verified ownership themselves. Samuel leaned in, asking, "Trusted or ignored?" And the murmurs in the courtroom told the story. Families whispered prayers, others glared at Clifford, and during recess, Angela Ramirez quietly approached Marjorie to say she understood why she was fighting. Marjorie touched her arm and told her she didn't blame the families, that they had been sold a dream that wasn't theirs to sell. As testimony wore on, momentum shifted clearly in her favor. Every document pointed back to her name, every expert reinforced her case, while the HOA sounded desperate and hollow. Homeowners wept in the pews, realizing their mortgages might crumble. Marriages strained, tempers boiled at HOA meetings, and Clifford's confidence finally cracked. By the final day, Samuel rose with booming clarity, declaring this was not just a legal case but a moral one, that the defendants had gambled with land that wasn't theirs and lost. Clifford's attorney tried one last plea, but the judge's expression revealed the outcome was already decided. The verdict came down in a packed courtroom. Judge Long declared that Marjorie Whitfield was the rightful owner of the land, that taxes had been paid, deeds reaffirmed, and that the subdivision was built without her consent. Gasps filled the chamber, some homeowners sobbing openly, others staring blankly at the floor. Marjorie closed her eyes and whispered to her late parents, "We did it." The judge clarified that remedies and compensation would be determined in further proceedings, that families would not be immediately displaced, but their future depended on negotiations. It was vindication for Marjorie, uncertainty for everyone else. Clifford stormed out, vowing it wasn't over, while Marjorie stood on the courthouse steps telling reporters this was never about hurting families, but about protecting what belonged to her and her parents, and that the HOA had gambled with lives that weren't theirs to gamble with. In Lakewood Meadows, the atmosphere soured. Some families blamed her, shouting insults as she collected her mail, while others turned their fury on Clifford for leading them astray. Property values froze, banks grew hesitant, and families whispered at night about walking away. Clifford eventually resigned in disgrace. Hanover Construction tried to negotiate, but Marjorie didn't rush. She reminded Samuel that it wasn't only about money, it was about consequences, about showing that shortcuts and arrogance carried a cost. Still, she showed compassion at a church meeting, telling homeowners she didn't hate them and didn't want them to suffer, that her fight was with those who sold false promises, not with them. Some softened, some stayed bitter, but many finally saw her as a woman defending her legacy. In the end, she had preserved her parents' dream, not with rage, but with vigilance, and she had proved that silence was not surrender. Weeks later, she walked her property line with her cousin, paused by an old iron marker, and said softly, "Daddy told me never to let this go." In the distance, the rooftops of Lakewood Meadows shimmered in the heat, standing as both a warning and a monument to what happens when ambition meets resolve.